Yeah, today's podcast is obviously a little bit late because of me having to run a few errands. We're going to start out by putting on my Patreon into the chat. We're going to make this real quick. Anybody who's willing to donate, I really appreciate it. It's very much so appreciated. We're going to get basically down to business just to keep this as quick as possible. We're going to try to answer the question of why are young people not catching on with capitalism. We're going to be looking at the point of this and looking at it from a legitimate point of view of it and see where the actual source of it is. First of all is we're going to start out with the point of where they're basically getting an education system which is preaching basically a lot of falsehoods on Marxism first. This is basically where they tend to preach on the ideas of what's either socialism or communism is from what they want people to believe, but not what it really is. They don't actually look at the actual definition of what it is from an actual economic theory, from the actual definition of what it actually is. And when we look at the actual definition, it would be any of various economic or political theories advocating for collective government ownership and administration of means of production and distribution of goods. This is very, very simple, which means that basically we're talking that the government owns everything. And it does not mean that you're going to have the same privileges and rights that you do in a capitalist system. It's not basically a pretty much replace everything that you see in a capitalist system, replace all of those benefits, and you just basically slap on what you see as benefits of a socialist or communist system. It doesn't work that way. It is a complete and alternative different system, and you do not get any of the benefits of capitalism with this. All of those benefits of capitalism go away. Now, when you look at the actual systems of socialism or communism, you're going to be seeing that you do not get any of these benefits, and the actual production of any Marxist system does not have anything that they've really developed that has lasted. The only exception that we should actually see is one minute exception, which would be the case of the Volkswagen Automotive Company that was developed by Adolf Hitler and Dr. Ferdinand Porsche. And that's the only one exception amongst every instance. Every other case, we're talking that basically everything that was developed for military usage. Even when we're talking about such things that have come out of the areas, such as audio tubes or electronics components from these areas, they've all been originally meant for military usage, and they've been, since those things have been decommissioned, they've now exited the regions as being able to be used for other purposes, and they've been repurposed. And this does not mean that they were initially developed for those purposes. It means that basically they were developed for military usage only, to serve the actual purpose of a military state. And that's essentially what you're going to get under a Marxist system. And when it comes down to all these benefits that you try to state with it, they'll try to state about free education. Well, you need to understand about the quality of the education. this becomes indoctrination of the state. People try to state about the beneficiaries of being literate. Well, it's fine out that they're going to have a high literacy rate, but when we're talking about if they're only reciting what the government tells them to, it doesn't mean much. If they're not allowed to exert their own free will, it doesn't mean that there's anything valuable with that literacy. The literacy essentially means nothing. When we see that that there is no actual ability for personal expression, personal freedom, this is where the whole problem comes from. And none of these are actual parts of a capitalist or socialist, or I should just say, sorry, a socialist or communist system. And that's what needs to be understood. Now, the problem is what they try to do is they try to assert that that you're going to get these freedoms you find in capitalism, and they're going to just be transplanted, number one. And number two is that they assume that what Marxism is whatever the people tend to want to associate as a positive system of the day. Whenever something is going good, that tends to have some value of it, they tend to gravitate and call that Marxism. And they will do that the moment that it goes bad. They tend to push away from it. Initially, they were calling Venezuela a great example of a socialist paradise. Well, we see that that's completely crumbled. We see the fact is that they're calling. Now they tend to call areas like Denmark and Sweden this socialist paradise, but when we get the actual countries themselves explaining that they are not a socialist country, but rather socialist countries, but rather actual examples of market economies that actually have somewhat of a level of a welfare state, but they have extensive respects for freedom of property that far exceed the United States. It doesn't exactly look like we're talking about Marxism here. Marxists do not have any respect for freedom of private property, and they don't like that. Essentially, if someone was able to acquire a great deal of private property, they feel that that would be an example of hoarding, and they should have that taken away from them. Now, in the system of Denmark or Sweden, they respect that person, and they would never take away that private property. Now, that's not exactly what you're going to find in a Marxist system. They would never do that to a person like that. And what we find with the other problem is that they tend to, the other problem that we're finding with a lot of these young people is that we're finding that a lot of them are associating our system of crony capitalism, which is where business and government come together and create a system which is not exactly fair for the system itself, and it doesn't allow voluntary cooperation between two parties. And that's what we call crony capitalism. It's also called fascism in its literal sense. And when people refer to this as capitalism and label it as capitalism, this is where a lot of young people get confused. They assume that this is exactly what capitalism is, and they don't understand it. This is not capitalism, and we have not had capitalism in a long time. Now they need to understand that where this system came from. This is actually was a system that actually was created. This crony capitalism was created during the Progressive era. This is from Teddy Roosevelt. This is from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson. These are the people that put in all of these regulations and all of these things that allow government to essentially attach itself to businesses and vice versa, businesses to government, that created this system that we see today, that we try to label as capitalism. Now, how long has this been going on? Well, we know that it's been going on for about 125 years. So we can see honestly that no living person today knows what capitalism truly is in its actual system in the United States. We basically only we can tell you what it is in theory and what it actually has done in the past by actually looking at real history, but we have not been able to have it in practice in a long time, and that's because of what has happened to our country. Every time that we've tried to get closer to it, people have referred to it as a Wild West system, and by removing any type of barriers to get to capitalism. And this has been people on both the right and the left. Both have actually been advocates for blocking this. And one of the major problems is we talk about central banking. Now, central banking is not part of capitalism. It never has been and never will be. This is part of crony capitalism, and it even exists in part of Marxism. Marxist is basically the idea of centralization of everything. So basically, when we're talking about crony capitalism will centralize certain aspects of the economy. And in pure capitalism or authentic capitalism, they will not be actually trying to centralize anything, and it'll be just about the actual voluntary cooperation between the two parties that are trying to interact with one another. And there will not be any government intervention between these two. And this is how capitalism works. Capitalism does not work by force. You do not need to force people to cooperate with one another. That's the whole idea of capitalism. This is how it works, and you don't need to force the system to work, because it just works naturally, and all you have to do is essentially make sure that collusion is not happening, and that people are free to choose who they want to do business with. And that's how we create a system in which is fair for everyone. Now, how does government obtain the products that it needs to obtain? Same way everyone else does. They don't essentially create these crony contracts. They would be buying a la carte, and they would buy as needed. Now, this ensures that that what they're doing is they're not going to create a system of winners and losers. They're going to be buying the best product in a way that best suits their needs. And this will ensure that they're not going to be going to war when not necessary, when it's not necessary, and they're not going to be stockpiling a lot of goods when they're not necessary either. And this is going to be the point. And they're going to address a foreign policy that is going to fit to the best role of the country. If the country does not need to be doing anything, they won't be stockpiling any weapons or any of these other little toys or anything. And this is key. Now, when it comes down to what we can really do for the problem is we can go back to the idea of ending this indoctrination in schools and actually return to actually teaching students, which, as you're going to see in the description, is basically what teachers once did, even if the material was erroneous. Now, and this is basically the problem why it was erroneous, was basically we had revisionist historians giving them bad material. And it wasn't the teacher's fault with this, it's basically what happened. Now, the actual way to fix this is to actually look at what really happened. Now, when we start looking at this, we can actually fix this whole problem with actually looking at history and what really happened, and start giving people the honest truth by looking through records and giving them the actual legitimate truth, not some bastardized version of what you want to make people look at either America or look at these other countries at what really happened. Now, this might be a hard thing to do, because in certain cases it's going to make European countries look bad, or America might look bad in certain lights with it, like certain leaders might look bad. But in the end, with it, it's going to be best for America in a future sense with it, because we're not going to have the idea of what we need to be teaching these students as a whole with it, because you're supposed to learn from your mistakes of the past, and basically glorifying people just because they held the position does not mean that they should be basically glorified. I mean, you shouldn't be and you should not be making history based off of your political ideology. I mean, they made FDR out to be this great president when we can clearly see in history that he was clearly one of the worst. I mean, he put through Social Security. This was very, very unpopular. Nobody wanted it at the time. They felt that their individual savings were more than enough, and that they did not want to be forced into something. They felt that they could do a lot better on their own. But he basically went above people's independent instincts, and he felt that he knew better than the actual people. When we look at other aspects, he interned the Japanese in what they try to rename as an internment camp, but was really a concentration camp, no different than what Hitler was doing. Now, they call it internment camp because they want to basically paint America and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a slightly better light, so he doesn't look like one of these evil people like Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler, and or Mao Zedong as well. They don't want to paint him in this light, because it would really start to damage the reputation of the progressive era. It would damage the reputation of the Democratic Party and a lot of these values that they hold dear. And it would damage the ideas of the liberal foreign policy perspective and this idea of intervention. And it would basically kill every bit of it. And if they did that, it would basically, the actual idea of how we would deal with diplomacy would be completely different. We would not deal with intervention. We would not deal with acting militarily. We would only have bases guarding our own country, and we would only be dealing with diplomacy with other nations. And this would be a complete and utter change from what we see today. And you'd see things in the light of what people like Jim Jatras feel, as opposed to what Mike Pompeo feels. And it would be completely different. And this is why they tend to want to embrace people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and other ones like Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was just as bad. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt also did the New Deal. Now, they want to make you believe that the New Deal was a success. The New Deal was a complete and utter failure. They tried it once, it didn't work. They tried it again, it actually didn't work then, and that's when the war hit. Now, how did they enter the war? Well, basically, the way we entered the war was actually very, very suspicious as well. Basically, what it was FDR was working with the Chinese to essentially harass, blockade, and attack the Japanese. Now, this essentially, the Japanese were well aware of this. They got pissed. They went and they attacked Pearl Harbor after this as an actual warning shot. Now, their central intelligence was out essentially well more than a week before that they were going to do this, essentially because they gave a warning: you stop this or else. And he did not heed it because he wanted an excuse to get into the war, because he was very much into intervention. And he knew the people were essentially not into war because they were not that far out of the previous war, and they were not going to be very, very keen into that. And World War I was supposed to be this supposed war to end all wars, and they were not exactly. If that was supposed to be the war to end all wars, what the hell was this? So they were not exactly keen on entering in any type of thing going in between China and Japan, any type of conflict between those two, and they were not exactly keen with this dispute between countries like between the countries of Europe, when that was essentially a direct cause of the intervention that happened from World War I. When we look at World War I, that was basically Hitler rose from the effects of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, this is not reported because the fact is they wanted to make the leaders of Europe look a lot better. Now, it was the United Kingdom, actually the British Empire, that actually was the aggressor that caused World War I. They did not like the fact that the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany were actually working on a trade pact, and that would have contested the British Empire's dominance over the region. Now, since the British Empire was very, very paranoid of this, they actually attacked first over this, and they worked in with France to actually do this, because they knew it in the end with it, they did not want to have any type of dominance over the area that would have been influenced. And in the end with the war with it, they basically wanted sanctions on Germany to basically put them in a situation where they could not have capitalism, so in its truest form. So they basically had them being occupied by France, where they had to essentially, if they were going to take on progressivism, it had to basically be under the supervision of the United States and France. If they were going to take on communism, it basically had to be under the supervision of the Soviet Union. And if they were going, and the only other option they had, which was free, was socialism. And they knew in basically either the communist or the socialist systems, they knew they were going to fail. And even under the progressive system, they knew it was going to be so onerous with regulations that they were not going to be productive. And then when it came down to what the actual outcome of what it did to the Middle East, they carved the Middle East, which is why we have the conflict that we have today. This is what created Israel as well. What happened? Why was Israel created? So the British Empire could toss Jews down there, because it was a way to get rid of them, because they viewed Jews as an actual problem in their country. These were Eastern European immigrants moving into the poor regions of England. They wanted to get rid of them, so they basically used this as an excuse. These people were sitting there since the late 1800s. And this is why we had this. And what happens with these young people is they don't understand a lot of the history behind these events. And they don't understand that we have not had an actual real form of true history being taught in this country in pretty much in this century. Or I should say, even I'm not talking just this century, but last century as well, throughout even the 1900s, because the fact is, for most of it, they were trying to block people from learning the truth. And when we look at the ideas of capitalism, capitalism was not being really taught. We had what were called progressive schools as well. Progressive schools were essentially basically overseen by the Soviet Union. And these popped up during the 50s and 60s. And they were basically set up where they were overseen by the Soviet Union. And that was the way it was. And you were not going to get a real legitimate education. And these were basically portrayed as being the highest forms of education in certain major cities, and they would portray it as this, and yet you were actually being just indoctrinated by the Soviet Union, nothing more. And while we see this with it, it's basically nothing but garbage. Now we're still getting schools that are popping up like this. They're still popping in from actual countries that actually have these systems, these Marxist systems, and they try to portray themselves as higher education for younger children, and meanwhile it's complete and utter garbage. Not actually higher levels of developed education. And this is why you need to be very, very careful of what you put your children into, and why you should actually even consider homeschooling your children as well. Now, when it comes down to what these young kids are actually seeing, is they have never seen capitalism. Most of them have never even studied what real capitalism is. They're just told what the United States has currently is capitalism, and then when they're taught of what Marxism is, they're taught of this huge bill of goods, this basically this other side of the rainbow, and it's this lovely world of where everybody's happy and everybody's singing kumbaya, and they're not taught the actual reality of what it really is. They're never taught about the systems like Cambodia, or all the one-child policy things that have been going on in China, and all these other things that have happened. And what ends up happening is they have this complete distorted view of what the systems are, and they don't understand what it is. They don't understand that crony capitalism is not capitalism, and they don't understand what they're being taught as Marxism is not Marxism. And it's completely warped their ideas of what these systems really are, and I think that's a major problem. And what needs to be told is that what you're being taught is what capitalism is not capitalism, it's crony capitalism. And what you're being taught what Marxism is not Marxism, it's this fantasy dream. And people need to be taught what the real things are in the actual real sense, and what actually comes out in reality, and what you can really expect, not this little fantasy world. And that's what people need to understand is, and then where we're at with both, and that basically is what we're looking out there as we're not at capitalism. We need to get rid of a lot of things to get toward capitalism, and there are plenty of people and plenty of groups out there that are pushing for this. I mean, you can go to the Mises Institute. The Mises Institute has a lot of people pushing for capitalism. You go to the Ron Paul Institute. That's another one that pushes for capitalism. The Cato Institute is another one that pushes for capitalism. The Mercatus Institute is another one that pushes for capitalism. But there's not many other ones that do because of this, because they tend to push for crony capitalism because they believe in a military state. I mean, you'll find a lot of these other ones out there that are trying to say, we believe in capitalism, and they really don't. And you find these people that are basically into big government. Like, you'll have groups like AEI. AEI with it says they believe in capitalism, but they don't. They believe in crony capitalism because they want militarization of the whole world. That's not capitalism. That's crony capitalism. You have these Marxists that out there like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that are painting this idea of what they think Marxism is, and it's not the truth because they have to keep changing the names of the countries that they are supporting because they can't keep it up, because they know that if they stay with one country that is honestly Marxist, that the fact is they would have to that eventually when it goes sour, that essentially they would go down with the ship, and they don't want to go down with the ship. And that's what we're talking about here. And then when we had the education system is not being honest with people. And we're filling them with basically indoctrination instead of actually facts. And the only things that actually matter are facts, not feelings. And this is one of the things that I've actually sat by and told people is facts matter, feelings don't. You need a rational argument out there. You don't need an argument based on feelings. Throw feelings to the side. That's something completely different. Feelings do not matter when we're talking about a debate. That's something that is completely irrelevant. Now people are going to say, oh, you're being harsh, but I don't really care if I sound like I'm being harsh. Feelings don't matter in a debate when we're talking about issues. The only thing that matters is facts. If you can't come together with facts, basically you've lost. Basically, that's the whole point. And this is why when we're talking about why capitalism is not caught on is people are not bringing an effective argument. They're not telling these young people that, hey, your whole system is based on a lie. You're not being taught about capitalism. You're being told that capitalism is really a system of crony capitalism. If we want real capitalism, we need real capitalism. And when you get told about Marxism, you're not being told about real Marxism. You're being basically taught in the schools about this fantasy world. And what needs to happen is people need to be told about the truth about both, of what it is with it, what you're actually seeing, what you're actually being told about, and so you can get a real good story of what each is. And that's where we need to see it. And that's why it's very important. If you like this stream with it, I know it's going to be a little bit shorter with it because I had a few errands to run today. Make sure you like it, subscribe, click the notification bell, make sure that you share it all the way around, make sure you check out my Patreon and try to share my Patreon with someone else that you think might like it. And that's about it. Bye everyone. I'll be also coming today with the my podcast with the role of the U.S. on a global stage for those interested. And then I'll do my nightly podcast as well. It should be around the same time as I usually do it. That's about it. Bye.